Yes, I guess it seems now. Okay. So, okay, let me quickly introduce actually, okay, Peter, he has actually more than 20 years of experience in cryptography, information assurance and formal verification, and he has pioneered many of the applications, for example, process calculi to modeling and analysis of secure systems, things like that. And then prior to taking up chair in Luxembourg, he holds actually many other positions. For example, chair in computer science at University of Newcastle. He had actually done work with many of the organizations as well, including government communication, this GCHQ, CESG, Defense Research Agency, and many more. So apart from this, Peter also have actually been sitting in many of the prestigious conferences, for example, IEEE Security and Privacy and Computer Security Foundations, workshops and symposiums, and many more. And he has been published extensively in cryptography, protocols, security policies, and models for computer security. And more recently, he's been actually working in voter verifiable election systems. He has been a co-creator of several innovative verifiable voting schemes. For example, Pret Voter, Pretty Good Democracy, and many more. So without further ado, Peter, over to you. Please take this virtual floor away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You hear me okay? See me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you okay.
Okay, well, many thanks for the invitation to speak at this seminar series. I'm honored. It seems like a great initiative you've got here with, what is it, 20 or something UK universities involved. That's pretty cool. If we did that in Luxembourg, we only have the one university, so it wouldn't look so impressive. And perhaps it's worth mentioning, before I came to Luxembourg, I was at Newcastle University, and in fact, I think Cliff is in the audience. It was largely thanks to Cliff that I ended up in Newcastle, and also, well, as a result of that, I got involved with the DIRC project, Dependability Interdisciplinary Research Consortium, I think it was called. That's actually what drew me to get interested in voting systems, because it seemed a prime example, case study, if you like, for highly interdisciplinary security critical system, which were what we were studying within that project. So that's kind of what drew me into this whole topic, and that is, well, that's all started for me in about 2004. So I've been battling with this challenge for over a decade and a half. Okay, anyway, let me get into the meat of the seminar. So I've called it Trust and Trustworthiness of Voting Systems. So it'll be a bit of a sort of whirlwind tour. No, I can't. Okay, the up and down arrows don't work, but never mind. So just to quickly give you the outline, first of all, I'll talk briefly about the challenges of making elections secure. And then I'll go into this notion of end-to-end voter verifiability, which some of you perhaps in the audience will already have come across, but I'll just quickly refresh it. Then I'll do a bit of a whirlwind tour of, well, 3 of the sort of schemes that I've been involved in, including one which is actually only a few weeks old. This Hyperion at the bottom is really pretty hot off the press, but I think it's actually kind of quite cool. I hope you'll like it. It's somewhat similar to Selene, as you'll see shortly, but much simpler. Okay, so I mean, I think probably most of us here would agree that democracy is in a bit of a state of crisis at the moment. It's been taking a lot of knocks anyway. Most recently, and perhaps most scarily, in the US earlier this year, where it looked almost like democracy was going to collapse in the US. But we've had quite a few, I think, significant failures of democracy lately. I won't mention them, you can probably guess what I have in mind. So the question of making elections secure is a highly topical, highly important one for society, particularly at the moment. So yes, there's an image which I'm sure you'll all recognize of earlier this year in January. So what I want to talk about today is the challenge of trying to make elections secure and robust and so on, and recognizing that elections are very complex socio-technical processes, so involving not only technical aspects but also lots of humans, lots of procedures, and of course the whole conduct of an election involves also campaigning, the media, and so on and so forth. But that would be far too much to try and cover in such a lecture. So what I will be doing is focusing really on the vote casting and counting procedures. And just to remark that I've kind of come to the conclusion that this challenge of trying to produce such systems is perhaps one of, if not the biggest challenge facing the information security community. And I hope I'll try and illustrate that later on. But particularly because of the very sort of strong interdisciplinary aspect, you basically have to make the systems not only technically secure, but also usable and understandable by hopefully the entire electorate and so forth. That really makes it immensely challenging. Okay, well, there are various trends towards digitizing various aspects of democracy, and that can be sort of quite exciting. Potentially you can enrich democracy, public discussion, and so forth in interesting ways. But on the other hand, of course, like with all technologies, there are downsides as well as upsides. So this brings in lots of new and largely sort of poorly understood threats. In particular, I guess what has spurred quite a lot of the work in this area, including my work, is in the US, extensive use of voting machines, which, as I'll talk about a little bit more, is particularly worrying, where basically you have to sort of rely on proprietary code in these machines to accurately count the votes, which is really, in my view, absurd. And of course, there's pressure to try and move to internet voting. That, in my view, and I think of many other experts in this field, is very dangerous, certainly for critical elections. We don't, in my view, have any secure systems sufficiently secure to actually handle that, including some of the ones I'm going to talk about here. So I just wanted to stress that. So, well, ways that people have reacted to the threats of digitizing elections and democracy. Well, one is just to go back to good old-fashioned paper ballots and hand counting, which is basically what they did in Holland a few years back. What has happened in the US, at least one of the things, is to move to so-called voter-verified paper audit trails, and sort of associated with that things like risk limit audits due to Philip Stark and so forth. So ultimately, the idea is you can fall back on a paper record, which you hope is well curated and so forth, if there are doubts about any of the electronic tallying or whatever that's gone on. Another reaction is this notion of end-to-end verifiable, principally cryptographic schemes, which is what I'm going to try and give you a bit of a whirlwind tour of today. And of course, you can have hybrids of these, in particular the sort of two above, which I think there's actually a bit of a move. I actually rather favor this myself, of combining end-to-end verifiable schemes with ones that incorporate some kind of paper audit trail and risk limit audits and so forth. Okay, and of course, trust is crucial to all this. The systems should be, first of all, trustworthy, but they should also be trusted. I mean, if they're trustworthy but not trusted, they're sort of equally useless, really. And trust is, of course, of particular paramount importance in elections, but it's also important for society generally, e-commerce and so forth. Traditional voting requires a fairly high degree of trust in election officials and so on. And certainly in the case of these DRE type touchscreen machines that were quite widespread in the US, required complete sort of blind trust in the code running on the machines. So that's really pretty disastrous. So we certainly need to get away from that. And of course, plenty of instances of mistrust. So this is from Iran, I think, from some years ago. I rather like this slogan of "Where is my vote?" for reasons that you'll see shortly. Selene and Hyperion kind of answer that question in some sense, but try and do it in a way which avoids vote buying or coercion, which would be the obvious problem if you just had an easy answer to the question of "Where is my vote?" Okay, so probably need to speed up a little bit. So it actually turns out that in a sense, rather primitive technologies were used even by the ancient Greeks. I don't have time to go into that, but if you look at some of these sort of archaeological records, the Greeks in some sense tried to transfer some of the trust away from officials to, if you like, primitive technology. And the US technological approaches to voting have gone back over a century. So late in the 19th century, these lever machines were used, and I think perhaps until recently or even now are still used in a few sort of counties and stuff, incredibly really. Many of you probably saw, I guess this is back in 2004, there was a lot of talk about these punch card based systems and how you would have problems with hanging chads and pregnant chads and so on and so forth. And this is some judge whose name I forget trying to figure out what the voter's intent was on such a punch card ballot. So here's an image of one of these sort of notorious touchscreens. So here basically you just have to blindly trust whatever the code does behind the screen. Probably one of the better technologies in the US are these optical scanners. So basically this is where the voter fills in their selection, filling in bubbles against the candidates, and that's fed into a scanner, which digitizes it obviously, but also importantly feeds the actual paper ballot into a ballot box. So it's kind of automatically generating a paper audit trail, which is certainly a good thing. Okay, so what basically is the challenge, in particular if you're approaching this from a sort of end-to-end verifiable crypto frame of mind? Well, what we really want are systems which will deliver the correct outcome, obviously. But furthermore, we wanted that to be in such a way that this is in some sense universally demonstrable, that anybody can look at the evidence that's been created by the execution of the protocol, whatever, and confirm that this is the correct result, or perhaps show that in fact there were manipulation of votes and that the outcome is in doubt. And of course, we don't have a God's eye view of what the correct answer, the outcome should be because of the nature of ballot privacy. So fundamentally, we have to resolve this tension between transparency, if you like, on the one hand, and ballot secrecy, privacy requirements on the other. And with a sort of crypto information security frame of mind, we want to try and do this as far as possible with minimal trust assumptions, without having sort of trust entities or code or whatever. And it would certainly seem that cryptography is the right kind of tool for this. And hopefully I'll give you a sort of clue as to how cryptography can help with this. But of course, we will keep facing the issue that a lot of people really don't feel comfortable with cryptography, don't really understand it. So we might have trustworthiness, but we may not achieve trust if we rely heavily on crypto. Okay, so let me just give you a very quick high-level view of this notion of end-to-end verifiability. So basically the point is to empower voters to check that their vote has been accurately counted, as sort of fetched up unchanged in the final tally. And there are basically sort of three aspects to this. yeah, at least in the sort of standard way that this was approached. With Selene and Hyperion, we'll see a slightly different approach, but so now this is just talking about the sort of standard way that this was done until recently anyway. Basically what happened is at the time of casting, the voter would get some kind of what Ron Rivest calls a protected receipt, some kind of encryption or encoding of their vote, which they get to keep. And then that should then get posted to some kind of web bulletin board. Nowadays, people might call that a public ledger or something, blockchain, whatever. But we were doing public ledgers long before the blockchain people were. So these receipts get posted to this bulletin board, and the idea is, of course, that voters can check that their receipt appears correctly on the bulletin board. And then later on, when it comes to tabulation, you basically have a set of encrypted votes, which hopefully people have agreed are, have been cast by legitimate voters and so on and so forth. And you can munge those using some fairly sort of standard crypto mathematics to anonymize them before you decrypt them, and then extract the tally in a way which well, you can do all of this in a verifiable fashion. I won't have time to get into the details, but you can basically extract the result and in a way which will guarantee the privacy of the votes, apart from sort of corner cases where you have a unanimous vote or whatever. But so that part is sort of fairly well-known crypto mathematics, that last part. Bulletin board, okay, I think you're probably all familiar with the notion. It's a sort of append-only immutable ledger, if you like, with a property of secure broadcast, so everyone should have a consistent view of it. So as I say, nowadays, people might like to call that a distributed ledger technology or something. So to give a sort of picture, not terribly well drawn, I'm afraid, but it's the best I could do on a tablet. You have a voter sitting somewhere, perhaps in a polling station or at home, whatever, has a device that creates an encryption of their vote. That is then posted to this bulletin board in, say, the left-hand column. It then, for example, can be put through a sequence of mixers, verifiable mixers, to ensure the anonymity, and then finally verified decryptions. So at least in this approach, you get all the votes out in clear text, but in a shuffled order, so nobody should be able to link them back to the original receipts, and hence not back to the voters. There's, in some cases, you can do this slightly differently. You can use homomorphic properties of the encryption algorithms, so that you can, in some sense, munge all the votes together, sort of add up the votes under the encryption, and then just decrypt the totals. So you don't actually have to decrypt any individual ballots. So again, that gives you ballot privacy, but by a different route, if you like. And they're the sort of two principal ways of doing the tabulation in this kind of system. I mean, hopefully that's all sort of fairly clear, at least at a very high level of abstraction. Please do stop me if you want me to elaborate on anything. Okay, let me just quickly mention, at least very informally, some of the properties. Obviously, we want integrity, accuracy, that the outcome accurately reflects the legitimately cast votes. We have this notion of individual verifiability, which basically boils down to, well, first of all, establishing that your vote is correctly embedded in this receipt. And also, I guess, the ability to check that your receipt makes it to the bulletin board and into the tabulation. And then we usually talk about universal verifiability, which is this fact that basically anybody should be able to verify this processing, this tallying process that goes on the bulletin board. Typically, this will be accompanied by lots of sort of zero knowledge proofs of shuffles and so forth. All of this should be verifiable by anyone with access to the bulletin board. Often we also have sort of additional requirements of, say, universal eligibility verifiability, which is just a way for anyone to verify that the votes that are being posted to the bulletin board have all been cast by eligible voters, and most one vote per voter, and so forth. Okay, and then for secrecy requirements, well, what we find is that we have to go into sort of increasingly strong notions against increasingly strong notions of adversary. So the first sort of obvious notion is ballot privacy, basically, that just someone who's kind of observing the protocol, the bulletin board, and so forth, shouldn't, on the basis of that, be able to figure out how any individual voter casts their vote. But it turns out, particularly when we move into the kind of schemes I'm going to talk about, where there's a lot of sort of additional artifacts being produced, for example, the receipts that the voters hold, we actually need stronger properties. So the next one up, if you like, is receipt freeness. Basically, that the protocol should not generate any or produce any way that the voter can prove to a third party how they voted, even if they're prepared to collaborate with the voter. And then an even stronger property called coercion resistance, which basically says that the voter should always be able to cast the vote they want, even if they've got a coercer breathing down their neck, giving them instructions before, during, and after. But they can still get away with casting their vote, and without that being sort of detected by this coercer. And that, I think you can imagine, is very difficult to achieve. In fact, arguably impossible, of course, if the coercer is breathing down your neck for the entire duration. So typically we have to assume that there's at least some period the voter can act independently. And of course, there's a raft of other properties, which I'll just skip over, but are also quite important, but I kind of alluded to them. And in a sense, what I've been trying to do with some of the schemes that we've been coming up with over the years is to make them simpler, more usable, more understandable, more accessible, and so forth. Okay, so for the kind of schemes that I just described, the assurance argument basically stands on three legs. So I think I mentioned already, first of all, the voter needs to be confident that it's really their vote that's buried in this ciphertext or whatever. That, of course, is not trivial, as you can imagine, because a human being can't really check on an Elgamal encryption or something. Then voters, well, yeah, we need to be sure that legitimately cast votes end up correctly on the bulletin board and fed into the tally process. And then finally, we need to know that the tally process is performed correctly. So now, in my view, it's the first one, which is the really challenging, really interesting one. So how do you convince a voter that it's really their vote buried in the ciphertext, but in a way that does not generate any sort of proofs that would, any artifacts that would violate receipt freeness or coercion resistance? So I think I'll skip on the other couple of bullets in the interest of time. So let me just give you a 2-minute introduction to, I guess, the first scheme that I came up with, actually in Newcastle in 2004, which I dubbed Prêt à voter. She was rather proud of the name. So the key idea is that voters, and it's an in-person voting, so it's in polling station. Voters, when they register, are given sort of sealed in an envelope a ballot form, which looks sort of fairly standard, certainly to UK voters. It has a list of candidates down the left-hand side. But the key point about Prêt à voter is that on each ballot, this candidate list will be independently randomized. And the information defining that order is carried cryptographically somewhere, for example, a ciphertext on the ballot form. So you get something which would look a bit like this. If you picked out another one, it would look pretty much the same, but you would see a different order of the candidates down the left-hand side. Okay, so the idea is the voter goes to the booth, takes this out of the protective envelope, marks panoramiques, for example, on the right-hand side, and then destroys the left-hand side, which gives this clear text order of candidates. And so now you can see that this, what is left, constitutes in a sense an encryption of the vote. Anyone looking at it shouldn't be able to interpret what that means as a vote, as long as the left-hand side has been destroyed, discarded. So that's the sort of key way that the encrypted vote, the protected ballot, if you like, is generated with prêt-à-voter. Now, what's quite rather nice about prêt-à-voter, in contrast to many of the other schemes, is that so the correctness of the encryption of the vote depends on these ballots being well formed, right? So that the order that's displayed in plain text matches the one that's buried in the ciphertext, and that's something that you can basically audit. You can do a random sample of ballot forms. The voters themselves can, perhaps take several ballot forms and elect to audit, n-1 of them, and check that they're well formed in that sense. And so get, as long as they all pass audit, then you're fairly confident that the whole batch are well formed. You shouldn't use an audited ballot form because, of course, in auditing you typically violate, a lot of. You have to, for example, reveal the randomness of the encryption, so the secrecy of that ballot form is violated. So it has to be a kind of statistical process, at least in this kind of approach. But what's rather nice here is that you can see that we can do these audits. There's no privacy violation. You can actually audit forms even before they've been associated with a voter, let alone had a vote added to them. It's just a property of the ballot form itself. So that leads to very clean dispute resolution. So other schemes where you actually have a device which on the spot produces an encryption of the vote, a vote that the voter puts in on the touchscreen or whatever, you can do these kind of audits, but then it becomes potentially rather difficult if the voter says on an audit ballot form that, well, this is decrypted to Kerry, but I voted Bush. And how do you decide whether the voter is lying or mistaken or whatever, or and whether it's really the system that did misbehave? And incidentally, there's also, you avoid sort of various side channel leakage problems that would also arise with on the spot encryption of the vote. So prêt-à-voter has some nice features to it, and I think it goes some way to handling this challenge of trying to find a way of convincing voters that their vote is correctly encrypted, but without in any way undermining ballot privacy and coercion resistance and so on. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but not in the time available right now. And I actually saw this, I think, after I'd come up with prêt-à-voter, but potentially it could have been an inspiration for prêt-à-voter. It wasn't. Okay, so let me now shift gear. So that's, hopefully that's given you a sort of quick overview of at least the conventional approach to end-to-end verifiability, and has given you a hint as how one particular system tries to address what I regard as the key issue, this cast as intended assurance property, to give it its sort of formal name. Okay, so a few years back, I was having discussions with actually a colleague of mine whose skepticism about all of this actually prompted me to sort of rethink things. Now, what I described, I hope you agree, seems quite nice, at least in a conceptual, technical sense. But obviously, in terms of understandability and so forth, it is not ideal. Voters have to handle these encryptions of votes. You can see the assurance argument that I gave is quite delicate. It's a sort of classic computer scientist's indirection kind of construction. These ballot audits can be cumbersome, non-intuitive. In Germany, for example, something like this is probably disallowed under federal law. They have a law which basically says that anyone without any particular training should be able to understand and can check for themselves the conduct of the of the election. So something like this is probably not even legal in Germany. So there are clear downsides. So that prompts one to think about other approaches. And in particular, this prompted me to sort of revisit an old and very simple idea, which is to have tracker numbers, private tracker numbers. So now on the bulletin board, basically you display votes with tracker numbers. And so voters can just directly check their vote in plain text in the tally using the tracker number. Okay, so that's very simple, very intuitive. No encrypted ballots as such. So the bulletin board might look a bit like this. But there are some fairly obvious downsides, which I'm sure are immediately obvious to you. And the two glaring ones are, well, first of all, we have to guarantee that all voters get unique, distinct trackers. I think you can immediately see if the system can arrange for the various voters who, say, are likely to cast the same vote to end up with the same tracker, they will all verify a vote on the bulletin board, be happy, but in fact they're all verifying the same vote, and so that then allows the system to potentially ballot stuff the bulletin board with other votes of its own choice. And of course, perhaps more significantly, it's also clearly open to coercion, because now, at least in the naive way of doing it, and the way it was done, suggested in the past, the coercer would simply ask you for your tracker number, and they can obviously verify your vote just as easily as you can. So I was rethinking this, and it occurred to me, well, one way that you can at least mitigate the coercion is, the voter doesn't actually need to know the tracker number at the time they cast their vote. They only need it later on when they verify their vote. So what about if the system only notifies the voters of their tracker number sometime after all these vote tracker number pairs have been put up on the bulletin board? Now that seems to help quite a bit, because now if you're being coerced, you can look at this bulletin board, you can identify a tracker which points to the coercer's vote, and you just claim that that's the tracker number if you happen to be challenged by the coercer. So that's really the sort of key starting point for the Selene scheme. So the goals are to guarantee that voters get unique tracker numbers, and then to notify them of their tracker numbers sometime after the information's gone up on the bulletin board, in a way which gives them high assurance that it is their, if you like, designated unique tracker, but also in a way which is deniable, that if they are really pressed by an aggressive coercer, they can still equivocate about what is their tracker number. And we want to do this in a distributed fashion and so on, but let's skip on that. So I'll go through this very quickly, and by the way, throughout this, I'm skipping a lot of the sort of crypto detail. Obviously, happy to go into things later on or offline, or give pointers to papers that give all the details. Basically, we're using fairly standard so-called El-Gamal crypto, which many of you may already know about. It's a randomizing encryption, public key encryption algorithm. We don't really need to worry about the details too much. But in a sort of abstract way, what basically goes on in the setup for Selene is that a bunch of tracker numbers are posted on the bulletin board, and these are all then put individually into, encrypted basically. And you can think of these as being kind of like safe deposit boxes which require 2 keys to open. So one of these keys is held by the voter, the other is held by the election authorities, if you like, the sort of bank key, and is only handed over to the voters later on at this notification time. And what's the real magic about the construction that we came up with Selene is the way that the voter can sort of lie about this. So the construction is such that with the secret trapdoor key that the voter holds, they can actually create a fake bank key, if you like, which then allows them with the two keys to open an alternative box, and so to an alternative tracker. So if they're really pushed by the coercer to reveal not only their tracker, but also this cryptographic key, bank key, as well as their own private key, they can fake all of this and basically lie to the coercer. But the really beautiful twist to this is that if you, without the voter's secret key, it's intractable to create a fake bank key, which will open to an alternative tracker. So that means that in some sense, the bank keys are kind of self-authenticating. Basically, when the voter gets this bank key and it indeed opens one of these boxes to a valid tracker number, they can be fairly sure that it is the true key and leading to the true tracker in some sense. I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm going through it very quickly and skimming over a lot of the technical details. Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, I'll probably skip on a bit of this, but this basically is to give a hint of what happens in the setup phase. So basically, public keys, signing keys for voters will be posted. So each voter will have a row, if you like, on the bulletin board. Then there will be an encryption of the tracker under the public key of the election authority will appear. And then there's this sort of trapdoor commitment to the tracker, which is this, if you like, dual key bank deposit box. But let me skim on this. Voting is sort of fairly straightforward, the way you would kind of expect with pretty much any internet voting system. The voter's device creates an encryption of the vote. It signs it with its signing key, sends that in, and that is duly posted to the appropriate row on the bulletin board. And there are various proofs of plain text awareness and so forth for technical reasons. So of course, later on, the proofs and the signatures are checked. And for ballots which have passed those checks, the encrypted votes and tracker numbers are pulled out, if you like, and then they're put through parallel mixers as pairs, and then finally decrypted. So at the end, you get pairs of tracker numbers with plain text votes, which is what we were sort of promising at the outset. And well, here you get a sort of a little bit of a hint of the crypto under the bonnet. So now when we reach the notification stage, basically the sort of randomization factor of the El Gamal encryption. And for those of you who know a little bit about this kind of thing, basically what we've done is we've used El Gamal, but we've used it in a slightly strange way. We've used the sort of payload carrying part of the El Gamal ciphertext. As you know, El Gamal is basically a pair of elements of the group, the Diffie-Hellman group. One of these will have the plain text in it. The other will carry a sort of randomization factor, which is this G to the RI. Now, basically, the trapdoor commitment is the payload component of the El Gamal in some sense. Does my pointer work? Doesn't seem it does. Okay, never mind. So basically what is happening at the notification time is that the voter is being given the randomization component of the El Gamal ciphertext, and these can now be put together, and it can be decrypted using the private trapdoor key of the voter. Okay, I think for time I better skip on this, but basically we can argue what I was just saying earlier. We can prove that, well, it's easy to show how the voter would compute an alternative randomization factor if they need to, using their trapdoor. And we can also show that it's basically intractable. It reduces to decisional Diffie-Hellman for someone without the trapdoor to come up with an alternative key which will open a box to a valid tracker. The chances of that are sort of negligible. Okay, so all of this seems rather appealing. It seems to give a much more direct way for voters to vote, to verify their vote. It also gives quite strong coercion mitigation, we call it, because it's not completely coercion resistant, as well. This slide is meant to point out. After we'd constructed this, rather annoyingly, we realized there's this kind of sting in the tail that, okay, so a coerced voter comes up with some alternative tracker number from their own and tries to claim it as their own. And one danger is that the coercer says, well, but that can't be because that's my tracker number. Or alternatively, if he's tracking a whole bunch, coercing a whole bunch of voters, some of them happen to collide on their choice of faked tracker number. So this, if you think about it, creates all kinds of interesting dilemmas for the voter. The coercer can't actually prove that it's their tracker by the whole nature of the construction. But of course, on the other hand, the voter knows that it's not their tracker number, so it could possibly be the coercer's tracker number. So maybe they have been caught out and they don't really know. So voters are in an interesting bind here. Notice that this doesn't break receipt freeness. It doesn't constitute any kind of proof of how the vote was cast, but it does mean that the voter can't reliably evade coercion, at least in an extreme sort of situation. Okay, so hopefully I have a few minutes just to move on to this newer scheme. And hopefully I can go through that fairly quickly because it's actually quite analogous to Selene, but much simplified. So all in all, it should go rather quickly. So like Selene, there is a sort of analog of bank deposit boxes, if you like. But now the boxes are actually empty. There are no trackers in them. And they're actually sent through these mixers along with the votes. And at the end, the votes are decrypted, but the boxes are left locked, if you like. And what happens now, once the voter gets their bank key, in a sense, working by analogy, they actually identify their vote by trying to open these boxes until they find one which opens with the pair of their key and the bank key. And that should only happen with one box. And so that tells them which is their row on the bulletin board after the mix. So allows them to identify their vote. And again, there are mechanisms to fake all of this if you're being pressured by an aggressive coercer. You can, again, fake a bank key which will open an alternative box of your choice. Okay, so that's kind of cool. So we've avoided the need for trackers entirely. So at first glance, that seems to have avoided the sting in the tail that I mentioned earlier. Oh yes, and I couldn't resist. You can see I had a sort of childhood, Asterix-centered childhood. This scene from Asterix chez les Bretons reminded me of, or I was reminded of it by the construction I just described. So yeah, if you didn't have the numbers on the houses, but you had the key, you could identify your house by which door it would open. Okay, so let me just very quickly give you the mechanism. So we assume, at least at first cut, that voters have signing keys. Now, that might be a bit unrealistic in some contexts, but let's sort of go with it for a moment. If you're in Estonia, it's sort of a reasonable assumption, and perhaps will become more reasonable as time goes on. So the setup now is actually very simple. We simply post the list of the signing keys of the voters on the bulletin board. And we don't actually have to go through a lot of stuff that we previously had to do with generating and assigning encrypted trackers and so forth. And now the voting step is also quite simple and quite neat. And what's rather nice is that, so we want the voters to register to create or have an app, if you like, that creates a fresh trapdoor key pair. And we can actually arrange for them to register that at the same time that they cast their vote. Okay, so a vote sent into the authorities might It looked like a signature, the voter's signature, over a pair, which is again the encrypted vote, along with this newly created public key component of this trapdoor key pair, along with appropriate zero knowledge proofs, which I won't really go into the details of, but for example, it'll be a zero knowledge proof of knowledge of the secret key corresponding to this public key, which for technical reasons turns out to be sort of quite important, as usual, in fact, with any sort of registration of public keys. Okay, so HI is the public key component, XI is the secret key component of this trapdoor key pair. So now this is posted up on the appropriate row. Later on, the proofs and signatures and so forth are checked. And for the valid, for ones which pass all these checks, then we extract. Right, let me get rid of this, blocking my own slide. I can't seem to get rid of that. Yes, so at this point, what happens is we generate the sort of analog of the commitments, the trapdoor commitments that we had previously, except here it's kind of much simpler. We take the HI, the trapdoor public key for each voter, and it is raised to some random RI. And this can be done in a distributed fashion by several tellers again. And there's a corresponding what we call alpha term, which is the generator of the group G raised to the same RI, but that is kept secret. That is not displayed or sent to the voter at this point. It's sent later at the notification time. Okay, so we get something that looks like this top row. So you can see at the end here, then there's the HI raised to the RI. Okay, now for tallying, we extract the encrypted votes and these trapdoors, and now we put them through verified parallel mixes, again, rather as in Selene. But there's a twist here. We do a slightly special kind of mix on these commitment terms. We put them through what's, I think, called an exponentiation mix. So in fact, they're all raised to a fresh secret random, to a common secret random, the same random SI. Okay, and then we decrypt the votes at the end. So now we end up with clear text votes and these shuffled, transformed commitment terms. Okay, and now notification is much as before. So now the alpha for the ith voter is sent to them. So this is now G to the RI times SI. And all the voter has to do is, once they receive this, is they raise it to their secret trapdoor key XI, and this should then match one of these commitments in the shuffled output, identifying their row and vote. Okay, so much simpler than previously with Selene. Okay, well, again, you can evade coercion. It seems to sidestep the sting in the tail at first glance because there are no trackers, for example, but actually if you think about it, the sting into the tail comes back again because now the voter, if they're trying to evade coercion, points to an alternative commitment. But now, of course, at least if you do it naively as I've described so far, the coercer just says, well, no, that's my beta. So to get around this, we introduce an extra twist, which is actually to introduce individual bulletin boards for each voter. So you can think of this as having an extra shuffling, mixing stage, if you like. So each voter will have their own bulletin board with a separate permutation of the votes and commitments. So that sidesteps. Now the coercer can no longer sit next to the voter looking at their individual bulletin board, and when the voter points to a particular beta, the coercer cannot plausibly claim to recognize that as their own beta because of this additional shuffling. Okay, there's again not a terribly good picture, but trying to give you a hint of what it might look like on the bulletin board. Okay, well, I'm pretty much done. So I just added this slide. I like this. It's kind of a bit like going from Harrison's marine chronometer Mark 1. It's kind of like Selene, and now we're up to Mark 4 chronometer, much simpler, more elegant, I think. Okay, so let me just wind up. I have a few minutes just to wind up, do I? Okay, so well, Selene and perhaps even more so Hyperion seem to give a very nice notion of voter verifiability, much more direct, and in particular, it seems that the kind of the ballot audit process that I was hinting at earlier with the conventional way of doing things, that's no longer seems necessary in some sense, because if your device encrypts the wrong vote, you should be able to detect it at the end using the mechanisms I described. You see the wrong vote in plain text in the output of the tally. Of course, that simplicity does come at a cost, and in particular, dispute resolution becomes a lot harder. I mean, now you can imagine a voter at the end says, well, okay, I've checked, but the vote that I find is not the vote that I put into my app. Now, how do you figure out where did it go wrong, or is the voter just lying? Let me skip on that bullet. So, I mean, I think that point aside, we have a nice, understandable way of doing voter verifiable voting. It provides a strong degree of receipt freeness and indeed a pretty strong notion of coercion resistance. Let me emphasize that I, for one, would not recommend this for high stakes elections. One particular reason for saying that is the sort of conventional way of doing end-to-end verifiability earlier. If you do it right, you can actually do it in a sort of unconditional fashion, or at least not, it's not probably typically computationally unconditional, but it's, you don't need any particular assumptions. Now here in Selene or Hyperion, the verification, at least the individual verification, does depend on the secret trapdoor of the voter not being compromised. If you think back to what I said earlier, if an attacker has managed to get hold of your secret trapdoor, they can actually use that to then fool you about which is your vote, which is your row. So the verification process is conditional on the assumption of secrecy, that the private votes of keys of the voters are not compromised. Now that's probably not an unreasonable assumption, because I mean, to swing a significant number of votes, you'd have to compromise a lot of voters' devices. So maybe it's not too unreasonable, but it's still a little bit worrying. And I think just probably more as a final remark, another kind of cool observation is that actually with Hyperion, the way I described it, we did away with the trackers completely, but in fact, you could actually keep the tracker numbers. And maybe there are psychological reasons why that might actually be quite a good idea. And what's cool here is that in fact, if you are having to fake, you actually fake to your own tracker number. You find an alternative beta and you compute an alpha, which will open it, but now you open it to your own tracker number. You don't have to come up with an alternative one, so these sting in the tail problems go away. There's no way this can be the coercer's tracker number. So that's kind of cool. And in fact, potentially you could even publicly make public the association of voters with trackers, which is kind of rather remarkable, and means that in fact people could verify that everyone gets a distinct, unique tracker. I'll skip on that. Okay, well, I'm pretty much done. I mean, there's lots of work still to be done, particularly for Hyperion, and as I say, this is really fresh off the press, so there's still a lot of proofs and analysis to be done. We have been doing some trials on some of these systems, in particular Selene. I hope that we will now start doing some trials on Hyperion as well. And there's various other challenges like trying to make things quantum safe and even everlasting privacy and so forth. Okay, so that's me done. More or less on time.
Peter, thank you so very much. So thank you for putting a new light on trust and trustworthiness of voting systems, including digital democracy challenges and some useful notions also, requirements, and newly developed voting systems. So now we would like to open the floor for the audience. So please, audience, you can ask questions directly to Peter.
Do I
Yes,
need to
Shia, please.
chat? I'm not sure if I can view the chat and share at the same time.
Maybe I can ask actually, Ben, would you please ask your question directly, please?
Sure. Thank you for the talk, Peter. It's fascinating. So my question is, so in the context of things like voter ID legislation, so this is currently being proposed in the UK and is already in force in the US, and it's often sort of proposed as a way to increase election integrity, but is often criticized as a way of doing voter suppression by proxy, because many disadvantaged people don't have the kind of ID that they need to do it. Are the kinds of schemes that you're developing also susceptible to being used for voter suppression this way? Does your scheme require an honest authority to enact it?
Well, first question, which of my schemes are you talking about?
Either any, whichever one is easiest to answer for.
Well, I mean, if we go back to prêt à voter, that is kind of agnostic on that. There are in particular, there are no sort of signing keys or anything. So you could run prêt à voter in the way, at least up until recently, was done in the UK. You identify the voters or not. It's an in-person voting scheme, so you could use the conventional mechanisms. Obviously, Selene and Hyperion, the way I described them, I assumed that there was a sort of some kind of public key infrastructure in place, if you like, so that might start getting you into a situation where people, for whatever reason, can't acquire such public keys, might then be disenfranchised. Yes, I mean, there are issues like that to worry about. Incidentally, I don't think it's quite in force in the US yet. I mean, the Republicans in particular keep threatening and trying to bring it in various states and counties, but I don't think it's widespread in the US yet, but it's certainly a threat, and indeed is a danger of suppressing certain parts of the community. Not sure that was a terribly good answer to your question.
It's a bit of an unfair question, but thank you for the answer.